This is a short training video to introduce you to the basics of using field loops within CodeGen. So let's get started. I've got a very simple environment here. As usual, I've got a little setup script which, if we run it, is simply setting my default repository that I'm going to use, setting my current template directory to be the current directory, and my output directory also to be the current directory. I'm going to be generating some code from a repository structure. That repository structure has 7 or 8 fields in there, I think, and the name of the structure is part. It represents a single or a simple piece of data representing a part in a parts system. I've already set up, as you can see, a template called dataclass.tpl, and we're going to be generating a class that represents that repository structure part. The class will have a private backing variable for each field in the repository structure and expose each field via a public property. Let's open Workbench and we'll take a quick look at the template. So here's the template that I've already prepared. As you can see, I'm using the CodeGen file name special token to set the name of the output file based on the name of the structure that's being generated, and I'm using the variation of the structure name template that's going to upper and lower case and nicely case the results, and the DBL file extension. Then we're generating a class here, so a class has to be in a namespace, and we're using CodeGen's namespace token to insert the name of the namespace. That will mean that we have to specify the value of the namespace that we want to use on the CodeGen command line. And then we've got a public class declaration that again is going to create a class based on the name of the repository structure that we're using. And now comes our first field loop. We've actually got 2 in this example. Here's an example of a very simple CodeGen field loop. You can see we've got a field loop token, and then we've got a closing or end of field loop token preceded by the / character. And the idea is that when we're processing this template in conjunction with the repository structure, any code that we place between an opening and closing field loop set of tokens is going to get basically repeated for each field that CodeGen finds within the structure. And you'll notice that within the field loop itself, we're using some special tokens that are actually called field loop tokens, and we'll look at those in the documentation in a moment. But field loop tokens basically insert information about the current field that's being processed as part of the field loop. And you can probably guess that field name is going to insert the name of the field. Field spec is a token that inserts a synergy field specification, A10, D6, D5.3, I4, and so on, based on the current field that's being processed. So this field loop is basically going to give us a private backing variable for each field that's encountered in the structure that's used. And then down here we have another field loop, and this is where we're going to generate our public properties. Here's the beginning of the field loop. We'll find the end of the field loop down here. So essentially, again, we're going to repeat whatever code is found between the opening and closing field loop tokens for each field in the structure that's being processed. So again, you can see we're creating a public property using the field name as the name of the property. Notice that the backing field was prefixed with the character M. So we're going to have a backing variable called M something and a public property with just the name of the field. And again, we're using another field loop token, field type. This one inserts the synergy data type only, A, D, I, and so on. And we've got a get method in our property that is using, basically exposing the value of the backing variable. And we have a set method, which is in turn setting the value of the backing variable, the typical use of a read-write property in OO development. And that's it. That's what our template looks like. So let's see what happens when we generate from this template. Let's go ahead and close that file. Let's switch over to a command prompt, and we'll issue a CodeGen command. So we're going to say CodeGen. We're going to specify the name of the template as data class. That's the name of the template we were just looking at. And we're going to specify the name of the repository structure. In this case, my repository has a structure named part. Remember also that we had that namespace token used, so I need to specify the namespace that I want to use on the command line. If I forget to do this, CodeGen will issue me a warning saying this template needs that. In fact, let's see that happen. Let's try and code generate from there. So because of that namespace token in there, it's telling me template data class uses a namespace token, use -n or set sin-def-ns to specify the namespace that you want to use. So let's go ahead and add our namespace on here. We'll use the namespace data classes, and we'll go ahead and generate the code. So again, we've got one file generated. Let's take a look at what we've got, and you can see it generated a file called part.dbl. Let's go and take a look at that file back in Workbench, a little bit easier to see with some color coding going on. And here's the code that was actually generated. As you can see, if we refer back to the template, the special CodeGen file name has simply been used to set the name of the output file and does not form part of the input, or the output to the source file. You can see our namespace token has been replaced with the namespace that we specified, data classes. We've got public class part, that came from our public class structure name specification. And remember that we then had our backing variables with our first field loop. And if we take a look at that, you can see that here's the block of code that was produced by that field loop. So we've got our M prefixed backing variable names with appropriate synergy data types for each of those fields. Then if you remember, we had a second field loop under the comment public properties, and that was going to generate our property for each of those fields. And as you can see, here's the property for the ID field, here's the property for the group ID field, here's the property for the supplier ID field, and so on. And then after the field loop, if we refer back to the template, we had end class and end namespace, and there's our end class and end namespace statements after the end of our field loop. So that's a basic introduction to field loops. Let's just take a quick peek into the documentation. So we'll say CodeGen-docs and point you in the right direction when dealing with field loops. Obviously, we're using repository-based information here, so you might want to refer to some of the information in preparing your repository. And the main information for field loops you will find in this section entitled Field Loops. You'll find a brief introduction to how field loops work. Field loops can also be used in an inline mechanism, so similar to this where you've got the beginning and ending of the field loop token all on one line, and that can generate lists of parameters or anything where you need multiple field information in one line of source code. And then obviously what we did was just used a multi-line field loop, which like this one documented here. And you'll also find here's the documentation for all of the various different field loop tokens. And these tokens basically expose pretty much all of the information about each field that's available in the repository. So there's an awful lot of them. Some of the basics we used were field name. I think we also used field spec to get the synergy data type specification for the field. We used field type to insert the data type for the property ADI and so on. So that's where you'll find more information about using field loops within CodeGen. Again, remember, if you're not working on Windows, then you can always get to the documentation online. So codegen.synergex.com/help will take you basically to the same information in a web browser, and there's all of the same information available for you online.